Okay, this lecture accompanies Chapter 23, Ecosystems and Populations. And in this one, we're going to introduce ecology and populations and talk about why populations are important. And this is a very different kind of aspect of human biology because, the last couple weeks we've been talking about how groups of people may change over time. And when we talk about ecology, we're going to talk about the interactions, not how does one person's body work or how does heredity work or something like that, but how interactions affect the size of a group over time. And so we're going to describe ecology, its importance, talk about population growth, the number of people that live and um, interact in one area, and we'll talk about the overall human population on Earth. Um, and so, ecology is it's a study of the uh, interactions between organisms and their environments. And these organisms could be animals, they could be plants, they could be bacteria, but they could also be people. And so we talk about how the what it takes for the individuals to survive, how individuals may interact with other individuals, and then what happens to groups of individuals. How do groups change over time in size and in their characteristics? And groups do have characteristics that we can talk about. And then there's an interaction between organisms and the environment, the physical environment or the presence of other organisms around them. That populations can change the environment and the environment changes them. And so ecology is really this study of interactions. And so this affects that is what is kind of what it is. And so we talk about competition, we talk about crowding, we talk about resources, lots of things like that. All right, so in ecology, we're studying connections, connections in nature. And so prior to this last couple weeks, we've been talking about how an individual works, how its body functions, how its organs function. We've talked about homeostasis, um, all sorts of things like that. But when you get past individual organisms, you find that there's lots of connections with other organisms, and there's connections with um, not just organisms like you, but with other organisms that you may need for food or that might cause disease, and this can affect the physical environment. And so we talk about these kinds of interactions and connections. We talk about competition, predation, and sometimes things that are mutually beneficial. And in ecology, there's this hierarchy of interactions where um, individuals have to survive, and so you talk about what individuals need, but we also talk about populations, the groups that are present there, how fast the groups change, what causes an increase in the size of the group, or what can cause the group to decrease, how the group can affect the environment. One of the most important things when we talk about population is the size. How many individuals are present and how populations change over time. People are just like any other organisms. We reproduce, and so our population can grow over time. And in fact, if there's enough resources, almost always it will. And so populations can grow. There are most times conditions are right for populations to grow, and if in the resources are present, they'll grow at a steady rate, like 2% per year for most human populations. Um, and so this growth over time is referred to as the biotic potential, and it depends on fertility and the number of organisms present. Populations, when they're very low, individuals might have hard time finding partners, and they might have a hard time finding unrelated partners. And so population growth is very slow or non-existent when populations are really low. And then when populations are high, is environmental resistance, which may be that somehow there's a limit, that it might be that crowding causes lots of aggression, or that predators or disease, when at certain densities, those become more common, or there's competition with other organisms, or there's limiting food, or something like that. And sometimes even there's disasters that can randomly reduce populations. But populations can't grow forever. There's some resistance, although they can grow for a long time sometimes. Um, and populations have characteristics as well that are unique to a population. They have a characteristic um, density. They also have characteristics in the proportions of males and females, and they have a characteristic age structure. This is one of the really important ones for human populations, because age structure refers to the number or proportion of individuals that are in age classes. And these age classes are characterized by their ability to reproduce and their chances of survival. And so pre-reproductive age classes are generally from 0 to 14 for humans, and they're usually not going to reproduce or reproduce at very low rates, but they usually have good survival. Um, Maybe not always in every population, but usually survival is fairly high. And then the reproductive age population, this matters a lot. These are the individuals that are reproducing. And so the more organisms you have in the reproductive age population, the faster the population can grow. And then post-reproductive populations are where there's generally very little reproduction. Okay, and so like from 45 to 85, their reproduction is zero or nearly zero. Okay, and so in expanding populations where population growth is going on currently and likely to go on to in the future, usually the post-reproductive population is much smaller than the reproductive population and the pre-reproductive population. This gives you like a pyramid. And so these countries will have more and more individuals coming into their reproductive years in the future, and they're likely to have large classes of reproductive individuals. And so this can be very pyramidal in fast-growing populations, or just slightly pyramidal in slow-growing populations. Stable population growths have generally a pretty even age distribution, and so it'll look fairly columnar, with generally the decline seen in post-reproductive populations, those being the smallest age classes. And so those are stable populations, where the new age classes are about the same as the old ones. In some cases, we actually have declining populations, where there's a higher number of post-reproductive individuals than the other reproductive classes, and the pre-reproductive individuals there's a smaller class than currently in the reproductive years. This sometimes happens when conditions aren't so good, and individuals don't see things moving forward very well. So populations are important, and their characteristics are important, and we can predict kind of future population growth by looking at things like age structure. We also look at fertility rates, because those rates can change over time. And often what you find is that the highest fertility rates are in these these expanding rapidly cultures, and then the lowest fertility rates are in the countries where population is declining. And this often coincides, these high reproductive rates often coincide with high mortality rates. In places like least developed countries, which your book mentions, um, like in parts of Africa, Central and South America, parts of Asia, where conditions are kind of unstable, there are high mortality rates, and individuals can't be sure that they'll survive long or their children will survive long. And often they will unconsciously adopt a fast reproductive strategy where couples choose to have more children than they might otherwise have. In countries where conditions are fairly stable and individuals are pretty sure that the conditions in the future will be as good or better than they are now, often people choose to have lower fertility rates. And so in well developed countries, you often have stable or even slightly declining reproductive rates. And this change in behavior kind of depends on people recognizing the environment. And this is called the demographic transition. There's lots of questions on human population because human population has been growing rapidly. In the last 300 years, human population has gone from under 1 billion to about 7.5 billion, which is where we are now. This rapid growth has been an exponential growth, and biologists and people interested in human population growth are suggesting that, well, we see population leveling off in places like Europe, Japan, and in well-developed countries like Canada and North America for the most part. But population is growing rapidly in underdeveloped countries. And so the question is, will that population growth slow? Are we near the carrying capacity for humans on the whole earth? What's going to happen? And so this depends on the fertility of women. And so population growth will continue if you have high fertilities, and even under low fertility, it'll take a while to stabilize. A lot of this is also concerned about what is the carrying capacity of the earth for humans. How much food can we produce? How much resources do individual people need? And the concern about this suggests that somewhere between 7 and 10 billion is the carrying capacity of the earth. And if we produce more people, we will actually reduce carrying capacity over the long term because we'll degrade habitats. And there's also concern that because of this demographic transition, where well-developed countries generally fertility rates have declined, most of that growth in population over the next 50 years is suggested to be in the least developed countries. And these countries already have difficulty supporting the number of people they have. And often what you see there is acute poverty. And so there's lots of people are very concerned about this. There's when this was first understood that what was going on here, there were lots of movies, and so this Soylent Green is just a movie about it. It's kind of a disaster type movie. But there are case scenarios where human population has fallen, and there's lots of cases of this. And I thought I'd go through one case. This is Easter Island. It's an isolated island in the Pacific. It was settled by Polynesians, about maybe 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago. They reached it by canoes and settled the island and were able to establish a human population there. It's probably best known for the archaeological remains, the giant statues called moai. But there's lots of other remains of villages, farms, remains of plants and animals, and there are still some people there. Native Polynesians still live there. However, looking at these archaeological remains, Rapa Nui, Easter Island, we can tell that the population there increased rapidly. When the island was settled, there were villages on all parts of the shore. The island was heavily forested with a very large palm tree that produced edible fruits and resources to produce boats for fishing and building and things like that. And so the island's population increased rapidly, and we think the peak population occurred in the 1600s, just before it was rediscovered by Europeans. But about this time of the 1600s, the island experienced the loss of the forests, In fact, this unique palm tree went extinct. The people cut the last one down. Um, After the forests were removed, the soil eroded. There was the extinction of not just the palm tree, but other plant species that humans were dependent on. There's also widespread evidence of warfare and cannibalism. We think the population peaked well over 10,000 people on the island. By the time the Europeans rediscovered it, though, the population did not recover. It was in the hundreds. And so this is a good example of a society collapsing, the carrying capacity of the habitat being reduced, and kind of a permanent ruining of the habitat. This is not the only time human societies have collapsed. Many of the societies that we know from the Bible have collapsed. Hittites, Assyrians, Babylonians, some of the Greeks. There's also many, many others. This is a picture of the Anastasi, the Pueblo-dwelling Native Americans that flourished around 1200 AD, but disappeared. We just have their remains. Even the mighty Roman Empire collapsed. And the question is, historians often ask, is why? And often they can document war, or they may say changes in climate, drought, or cold waves reduced farming, and so there was famine and the cities were abandoned. We can also associate this with things like deforestation, soil loss. In Iraq, Americans have become very familiar with Iraq in the last 25 years. We know that what happened to Iraq was that the soil became very salty. It became salinized. That's accumulation of salt from irrigation. And it returned to a desert, but it was very productive farmland for thousands of years. In all these cases, humans probably exceeded the carrying capacity, and their efforts to maintain that population degraded the habitat. So it's a good warning for us.